Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today to discuss what's happening in Gaza. Um, Today is the seventh day in the truce that temporary truce that's happening for the exchange of prisoners between Israel and Hamas. As you know, there have been weeks of heavy Israeli bombardments following the October 7 attack by Hamas. And the situation is really dire on the ground in terms of humanitarian, drama that's been unfolding, and Israel is showing no sign of, willingness to discuss a ceasefire. The United States is not really pressuring on that. They're only pushing for some sort of humanitarian temporary pauses to allow for exchange of prisoners. So we want to discuss Gaza, and then we also want to discuss, hopefully, if there is any kind of prospect for peace in the weeks and months ahead. So I want to start with Khalid El-Gindi from Middle East Institute. Khalid, welcome. Welcome, Randa and Trita. Thanks for joining me today. Khalid, I told you a little bit earlier, how realistic do you think the goal that is stated by Israel, that goal of eliminating Hamas, and isn't that a recipe for a prolonged fighting and actually occupation, further occupation of Gaza? And then do you expect, if that were to continue, what do you expect will happen in the West Bank, in southern Gaza? Given the truce situation right now, do you think that could be prolonged? But at some point, do you expect we will get back to fighting, and then Israel will try to insist on elimination of Hamas? Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Kadir, and thank you for having us. I think the stated goal of eliminating Hamas is not at all realistic. It's in fact, as you suggested, it is a recipe for endless bombing and violence. Frankly, it's I think it was a disastrous mistake for the United States to echo that language at the outset of this war, that somehow Hamas could be eradicated, and that was an achievable goal. That has, I think, emboldened the Israeli leadership to carry out this ferocious bombing campaign in ways that are really unprecedented, even for Israel, which typically has not been terribly good at limiting civilian casualties in the past, and now we're seeing a considerable deterioration in that effort this time around. The overwhelming majority of people who are being killed and injured are civilians, and I think in much higher numbers than we've ever seen before. It's clear that Israeli military authorities have loosened whatever rules of engagement they might have been operating under to allow for maximum damage to the civilian population. As I said, the goal of eradicating Hamas is not going to be achieved. The sooner the United States and other friends of Israel can convince the Israeli leadership of that, privately or even publicly at this stage, I think it needs to be stated quite explicitly that is not going to happen. The sooner this horror show can come to an end, or at least begin to wind down. Hamas is a political movement, even if all of its leadership is wiped out, and there's no evidence that it has even come close to that. Even if its weapons are completely wiped out, and again, there's very little evidence that their military capabilities have been significantly degraded. But even if those were possible, there would be new leaders and new weapons would emerge, and Hamas would re-emerge in one form or another, perhaps more moderate, perhaps more radical. But as long as there is a need for a group like Hamas to operate on the basis of armed resistance, because there is an occupation and a blockade and decades of repression, that can only be sustained through violence. And so it's almost inevitable that we'll see violent resistance of one form or another, whether it's called Hamas or something else. So it's not at all clear even that the Israeli leadership is convinced itself that it's possible to destroy Hamas. I think that could also be a very useful pretext to carry out what I think is, by now should be clear to everyone, is not a rational, calculated war, but really a war of revenge and rage. And there is very clear intent to inflict maximum damage on the civilian population for one reason or another. And the goal of the stated goal of trying to destroy Hamas only fuels that mentality. So I think it's important for Israel's friends to point out that that's not going to be possible. We're already seeing a spillover in the West Bank. We're now in the worst violence that the West Bank has seen, and in some ways it has actually surpassed the second Intifada of 20 years ago. Almost 500 Palestinians have been killed just since the start of the year. People forget that this is the most extreme government in Israel's history, and the dramatic escalation that we see in Gaza and in the West Bank is a direct function of the extremism of this Israeli government, and it's being manifested in many different ways. So the spillover has already happened. The United States continues to call on Israeli leaders to hold settler terrorists accountable. That seems naive. Israel is not capable of doing that because they are, in fact, a government made up of settler extremists and in some cases even terrorists. So the symbiotic relationship between this ruling coalition and the violent settlers is not something that Western powers seem to fully appreciate. As far as the truce, my own sense is that the Israeli leadership, particularly the person of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, are very keenly interested in resuming the war where it left off a week ago. And Netanyahu needs that personally for his own survival. The moment this war ends, there will be a reckoning in Israeli politics, and his career is likely finished. So the longer he can prolong this war, the better off he will be. Again, these are calculations that the United States and other Western powers need to consider. We've long ago left the realm of self-defense, probably within the first day or two of the Israeli military assault. Nothing of what is happening now, I think, can reasonably be called self-defense.
Thank you, Khalid. I do have follow-up questions, but I'll get back to them. Let me go to Randa right now. Randa, just a few days into this start of the violence, you and I were in Turkey collaborating on a project, and we were discussing things in detail. And you've made some really sharp remarks in those days, like that were very prescient. And I remember you saying, that Israel will want to exact a very heavy toll right away, and then this could, perhaps blow over to this could start a regional war. And you talked about Hezbollah, and we discussed Iran, etc. So how do you see Hezbollah's position since then has evolved? I mean, there was obviously big fears about an Iran-US confrontation, and there has been some escalation in Syria, Iraq. So how do you see the situation today, after about 6-7 weeks? How do you see Hezbollah's position and the dynamic between Iran and the US?
It's very interesting in terms of where Hezbollah is and how they see the situation. The threshold they always had for regional conflagration and their involvement beyond what we have been seeing, because there is an active front on the Lebanese-Israeli war. I mean, more than 80 Hezbollah fighters have died already, A number of civilians have already died. So you already have a front. It's not a full-blown frontal attack, Beirut has not been attacked yet. Rockets from Hezbollah did not reach targets in Tel Aviv yet, or were not sent to Tel Aviv. So they are still, basically, the escalation is happening incrementally and proportionally. Basically, each side messaging the other, they don't want the big war. But at the same time, I think Hezbollah cannot afford but to engage in the war. So they need to be part of the war, but they don't need a full-on war. They don't want a full-on war for a number of factors, partly having to do with the situation in Lebanon. Although I have to say, the public opinion in Lebanon, beyond the Shia community and the supporters of Hezbollah, after having seen what's happening to the Palestinians in Gaza, is shifting, in support of basically making Israel pay for what it's doing to Palestinians in Gaza. So if Hezbollah were to decide to escalate even further in the future, once the Israelis resume their onslaught on southern Gaza, I think there will be more public opinion. There will be more public support for their decision. But also part of their calculus has to do with, Iran. Look, there are two files only that Hezbollah needs to have full blessing, and on which Iran, until today, and especially the supreme leader, maintains a veto power over the decision that Hezbollah makes on these two files. One is war and peace issues with Israel, and two is any kind of interaction, dialogue with the United States. These are the only two files. Everything else, Hezbollah is their own decision maker. Even, when it comes to intervention in Syria, I would be arguing they are the ones who are really making the case to Iran for intervention on the side of Assad in the early phase, when there was debate inside Iran about whether they should support Assad or not. But on those two files, I think Iranian decision-making, Iranian calculus is going to influence and has veto power over any decision that Hezbollah makes on this. So any future escalation beyond this incremental, proportional trend that we have seen until now followed on the Lebanon-Israel front will be made after basically a decision is made in Tehran, in consultation, of course, with Hezbollah about that escalation. Until now, I don't see, Trita will talk more about that, but I'm not getting any, hint until now from the Iranian leadership about their interest in going beyond what we have seen in terms of the engagement of whether their partner Hezbollah or their proxies, Iraq, in Iraq, in Syria. Now, Houthis, I think Hezbollah has more of a say on Houthis' decision-making than Tehran. And that will be coordinated it will be a trilateral coordination, most likely, Hezbollah, Houthi, and then Tehran. But still, the prospects of regional escalation or regional conflagration is not small or the likelihood. By the way, most of these weapons that have been used targeting US military assets in northeastern Syria, in western Iraq, in central Iraq, were not precision guided. And so fortunately to all of us, you know, they did not kill American, you know, servicemen and women. If that were to happen, you know, under that scenario, I mean, and you are going to see the Americans then hitting pretty big, you know, in terms of their reaction, then the prospect of regional conflagration is possible. I would also say that there is one criterion that Hezbollah has always applied from the get-go in terms of its engagement in support of any other member of the axis of resistance. And they have applied it in Syria's case, and they are applying it in Hamas' case. In Syria's case, the criteria in both these cases, the criterion is, will that fellow member of the resistance axis, basically, you know, facing the prospect of destruction? Will that regime in Syria facing the prospect of being upended? Will Hamas leadership or Hamas presence in Gaza facing the prospect of totally being disappeared? And in the case of Syria, they came to the conclusion when they entered early on in 2012. They entered in 2012. They admitted it in 2013, but they entered in 2012. And in fact, they were doing intelligence gathering operations on behalf of the Iranians in Aleppo, in Syria, gathering information from basically, infiltrating protest groups, infiltrating universities to gather intelligence about the movement, the protest movement and its leadership. I think they started even doing that in the summer of 2011, but they actually intervened militarily in 2012. Hassan Nasrallah admitted it in a speech in 2013. I think that decision was made then, early on, that that regime is facing a real prospect of getting basically upended. Remember, this was happening in the context of the Arab Spring. A number of Arab regimes have been, were pushed into, or leadership in many of the Arab capitals were pushed out. And they were really afraid that Assad will meet the same fate, and hence the decision to intervene. Now, they are facing what's happening in Hamas. So far, what has come out of Hezbollah, remember, their war room is very small. Their decision-making is very opaque. Very small number of people know really what's going on. And so I'm not going to go on a limb and predicting. Just based on what you hear and there, the information you gather from media that follow them, or that, or from analysts that are close to their second and third, circles around the Shura Council, it looks like their understanding until now, or their impression, their takeaway until now, is that Hamas is nowhere near facing this prospect of extinction, of destruction, that it has until now been able to sustain the onslaught of the Israeli onslaught. Now, if Hamas were to get to that stage that they felt Assad was at, when they decided to go full, get involved fully in the fight there, I think that will be a decision. There will be a debate between them and the Iranians. But remember, any kind of large-scale escalation by Hezbollah means fighting not only the Israeli military machine, but also the American, military presence. In Syria, they were fighting military groups, militias. Nothing compared to the Israeli military machine, nothing compared, of course, to the American. And so the stakes, so their chances of winning were much higher there, given their military capacities. With Hamas, it's a different matter. They will be facing two strong military opponents, and they have to take that into consideration.
Thank you very much, Rhonda. Tulita, very early on, it was interesting that, Hamas thanked Iran, and then Iran said they didn't know about this, and then Americans said, we kind of believe the Iranians saying that they don't. So I saw that as an effort to make sure that, it didn't escalate quickly. And then, but there has been some escalation in the region. But then one of the contributing factors perhaps to this regional dynamic was the fact that, Iran and Saudi Arabia had already started normalizing relations, and Raisi went to this Riyadh initiative, Riyadh conference, where, Arab leaders, including Turkish leader as well, they tried to basically create a new initiative for peace, prospects of for peace, and they've been making visits to major capitals. They were in New York just yesterday. So do you see that regional, chances of escalation being somewhat managed? And then do you see any kind of real prospect for that, initiative to be successful, to create a whole new peace process? Because we know Biden administration, where they stand even now, they're not really, they do say it rhetorically that, the only solution is two-state solution, but you don't see a big push by Washington. So how do you see those dynamics?
Thank you, Kadir, and great pleasure to be here with Khaled and Randa as well. In regards to the regional escalation, I think I agree with what Randa said earlier on. This is somewhat under control right now, but a lot of it is frankly also because of luck. On October 26th, there was a drone that penetrated American air defenses in Erbil, sent by an Iraqi militia, and went through all of those air defenses. It hit the barracks where the American soldiers were sleeping on the second floor, 5 a.m. in the morning, but by pure luck, the explosives on it malfunctioned and did not explode. Had it done so, we would probably have seen a dozen or so American soldiers killed, and that would have fundamentally changed the situation, and most likely the United States would have gotten dragged into a big war. The reason why in the last couple of days we've seen a decline in the number of attacks, in fact an almost complete stop of it, at least by Iraqi and Syrian militias, is not because of the deterrence the US has managed to put together in its own view by moving more ships, etc., to the region. It's because of the ceasefire. And fundamentally, from the very beginning, it was clear that the Biden administration's approach to deterrence was a rather incomplete one. It was focusing on deterring Iran, its allies in the region, from escalating the war by moving military equipment to the region, assets, and declaring its willingness to strike back and strike hard. That would probably have been sufficient if the situation was such that these other entities, Iran and its allies, wanted to escalate a war but didn't need to. I think the situation is the opposite. They don't want a big war. I don't think the Iranians were aware of what Hamas was planning to do, at least not the scale of it. They were taken by surprise, according to US intelligence, and certainly have not shown any interest of making this much bigger. But they may feel that they need to, going back to similar things that Randa said as well, which is if there's a scenario in which Hamas is significantly decimated, and the perception is that after Hamas, Israel is going to start a war with Hezbollah, which is a perception that incidentally also exists in the US government, in which there is a fear that the Israelis have tried to create a pretext to be able to expand the war in that direction. Under those circumstances, just moving assets there are not going to be sufficient. What you actually have to do is to also put pressure on Israel in order for it to restrain itself. Otherwise, escalation will take place. And the only example we have in the last 55 days of the number of attacks going down is not because of moving ships and assets to the region. It's because of the fact that there's a truce. And as a result of the truce, the attacks have stopped or significantly reduced. Going forward, that is going to be the same dynamic. So if the Biden administration prioritizes making sure that this war doesn't expand, then it also needs to prioritize a ceasefire, because it's going to be the thing that most likely will, the absence of it is the most likely thing to see the reinitiation of some of those attacks that can lead to a much larger war. In regards to Iran and Saudi, and the dynamics there. It's very fascinating to see how things have changed quite dramatically as a result of not only that normalization. The normalization at the end of the day is a manifestation of a much larger and deeper desire to be able to move towards a completely new security paradigm in the region. I think from MBS's perspective, it was strategic. It was not just a tactical move. It's of course been faced with significant challenges now. I think the Iranians and the Saudis are not seeing the situation entirely the same. They may have moved closer together on several different issues, but behind the scenes, I think what the Iranians would like to see with Hamas is probably very, very different from what the Saudis would like to see the ultimate outcome being. But it has created a situation in which the previous ideas that was guiding the administration, and I think still is, which is that they still have a chance of putting together a Saudi-Israeli normalization deal and organize the region against Iran and its allies by creating alliances between Israel and some of the Arab states. The fundamentals of that is just simply gone. The fundamentals of a desire for a Saudi-Israeli normalization from both ends may be there, but the military dimension of it, I think, is by and large gone. And moreover, the other underlying assumption of it has proven deadly. And that is the idea that you can completely set aside the Palestinians, that the Palestinian issue no longer is central. And as a result, you can go ahead with these Abraham Accords and integrate Israel into the region at the expense of any solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And so if the Biden administration returns to that proposition, I think we were going to see an even worse situation than what we have right now. But overall, to your question of whether the Biden administration is going to pursue a peace deal or not, can the region take it over? I think we have to come to the conclusion that any deal, any peace process in the region that is solely led by the United States simply does not have any prospects of success. The United States does not have the credibility to be able to get the type of buy-in for such a process. It clearly has shown itself by its own account. It says that it cannot control Israel, it cannot pressure Israel. Well, if that's the case, then it can also not lead such a process. Whether the region is ready to lead such a process or not remains to be seen. But at some point, the region needs to shoulder that responsibility, because the outside actors in the United States in particular, over the course of the last 40 years, have shown itself that it really cannot. And the Biden administration, as you said, talks about a two-state solution, but all of its effort was for a Saudi-Israeli normalization that further would have buried the two-state solution. And it talks about the Netanyahu government as a peace partner in that two-state solution, while Netanyahu literally the same day goes on Israeli TV and says that he's the only one that can prevent a Palestinian state from being created. The degree of double standards and hypocrisy simply have reached a breaking point, and there is a need for a different type of leadership for any type of a peace process to be successful.
Thank you very much, Tarita. Khalid, based on what you just heard from Tarita, this time around, I felt that things have been very different for Israel in terms of being able to kind of messaging and gaining the public support in the US. Even mainstream media is now reporting the things that are happening on the ground. So feel free to comment on that. I think how Israel's war of for hearts and minds, let's say, this time around has been largely unsuccessful in my opinion. But I wanted to ask you more about what the Palestinians, where they go from here, given there's this broadly general push in the international, arena in the region. Everybody's talking about, okay, look, we gotta figure this out. We need new peace, etc. But what would be the strategy that Palestinians can follow or must follow going forward, because all sorts of strategies have failed so far?
Yeah, thank you. So just quickly on Trita's point, I completely agree that there is there's probably no space for a peace process after this war, whenever that may happen. And particularly, I think it's unthinkable that this administration in particular would be in any position to lead that process. Maybe at some point in the future, a different democratic administration that has a very different approach to this issue, it's possible. But at this point, the United States and specifically the Biden administration has shattered what little remained already of American credibility. And I'm not convinced in any case, even if they were to lead the process, that they fully understand how to go about doing that. We haven't really seen any evidence that they truly understand Palestinian needs, desires, interests, grievances. The fact that they've been able to, been willing to allow this level of carnage suggests that they have a very high threshold for Palestinian civilian casualties, and they don't fully appreciate Palestinian grievances in any meaningful way. As far as the question of hearts and minds, I do think that the Israeli side has in some ways already lost the battle for hearts and minds. In terms of the general public, where they haven't lost hearts and minds are in major power centers like Congress and the administration, and most of the mainstream media, although the media, as you suggested, the narrative is shifting in large part because the scale of death and destruction is so high that it's impossible to ignore. It's just simply would be absurd. You would have to desperately go out of your way to try and ignore what's happening. So they've been forced by events, I think, to report on the reality in Gaza. But it's clear that Gen Z, as they're called, they have a very different approach than any of their previous generations. Certainly, my generation and older generations, Joe Biden's administration is completely out of touch with where even their own political party grassroots is, and that's a reckoning that will happen probably in the next year. We'll see how much damage they may have done to themselves electorally in the next 11 or so months. Where do Palestinians go from here? That's the million-dollar question. I don't think. I think there are a lot of very fanciful ideas about who or what may govern Gaza after, the quote-unquote day after. I don't think anyone is seriously looking at that. And I'm afraid to say that includes Palestinians and the Palestinian leadership. Certainly, they have said they would not go back to Gaza on the backs of Israeli tanks. That much is clear. The Israeli leadership, Netanyahu, has said they don't want the Palestinian Authority to go back to Gaza. That's something that needs to be dealt with. I don't think anyone fully understands who or what is going to fill the vacuum left by Hamas if and when it is dislodged, at least politically, from Gaza. And it may be that Hamas has given up the mantle of governance anyway, and may be more interested in returning full-time to the goal of armed resistance. But I can say a few things that I think with a fair amount of certainty. I don't see the return of the Palestinian Authority happening anytime soon. I think we're much more likely to see a prolonged armed insurgency of one sort or another. I don't expect we'll see any meaningful diplomatic process emerging out of this nightmare really happening in Gaza. I would not expect elections to be held anytime soon. A lot of the day after scenarios necessarily require some sort of election process to bring new leaders who are going to govern Gaza and give the legitimacy that the leadership of Mahmoud Abbas is so lacking. I don't see any real possibility for holding elections. The conditions on the ground in Gaza are not conducive to holding elections. And even if they were, let's say in a year's time, I'm not sure even then that the conditions of having more than 1 million people homeless living in camps is really the right environment to hold an election. But there's another reason, and that is, what do you do with Hamas in the case of an election? From the Palestinian standpoint, of course, Hamas will most likely not be destroyed, and therefore will have to be part of any electoral process. Certainly, excluding them would destroy the legitimacy of that process. And on the other hand, Hamas is so radioactive at this point that it's impossible to imagine the United States or Israel or really most European powers allowing that to happen. And certainly Israel has the means to directly disrupt that. So, Hamas, there's no way forward with Hamas, and there's no way forward without Hamas. That's the conundrum that Israel's zero-sum mindset has forced everyone into with its war of rage and revenge that is still completely attached to an eradicationist agenda that simply is not achievable. So until that mindset can change, I don't see any way forward for even Palestinian politics. Let me modify that slightly. There is some way forward, but it requires, I think, a lot of flexibility on everyone's part, and that would be to disentangle the merger that has happened over the last 30 years between the Palestinian Authority on one hand and the PLO on the other. The Palestinian Authority, it's possible to imagine an authority that governs, that is technocratic, that is depoliticized, that is not under the control of any one or even a group of political factions, but would generally have the consent of all of the main factions, including Hamas. That's a formula that has been in place on the Palestinian political landscape for more than a decade. But it's not something that Israel and the United States have been willing to countenance because it means legitimizing Hamas's role in Palestinian politics. But it's at least possible to imagine an authority that is not under the control of any faction and that could therefore receive international donor funds and engage in the process of rebuilding Gaza and governing and so forth. And the political body, the political address of the Palestinian people and national movement would be refocused around the PLO, which would need to be reconstituted to include Hamas and other factions to make it truly representative, as well as reformed and also revived, because it has been allowed to be dormant really for far too long. So if it's possible to have a political address in the form of a revitalized PLO, in which Hamas is also a part, and separate and distinct from a Palestinian Authority that carries out service delivery and governance and security on the ground, then there may be a way forward. But that will be difficult for everyone. It will mean Mahmoud Abbas has to share power in the PLO, which is his prized possession. It will mean that the West and Israel will have to come to terms with Hamas's more or less permanence in the Palestinian political landscape. And all of those are very difficult to imagine under the circumstances, but might become possible at some point down the road.
Thank you, Khalid. Randa, Khalid is saying, Hamas is not going anywhere. Obviously, Hezbollah is not going anywhere. In the earlier, weeks of the fighting, there was a lot of pressure on Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, and we could see a scenario where these, states have been truly, pressured into perhaps taking drastic action. And given that the Netanyahu government is committed to further fighting, and they could take it down to the south, they could, escalate with Hezbollah, etc. So those dynamics, from where I, from what I can see, they're not going anywhere. Like, those groups are going to be on the ground, and then the willingness on the Israeli side to fight and escalate will not go away anytime soon. So given those dynamics, and you have extensive background in bringing, opposing parties together in track twos and other, occasions, what would be for a, professional like yourself on track twos, like what would be your priority? What would be the immediate thing that you would want to do? Where would you start? I'm asking you to bring about peace to the Middle East, basically. But what is the most immediate, urgent problem that would need to be addressed by bringing these, obviously hostile groups perhaps together? What would you recommend in that sense? You're on mute, it seems.
I agree with Khalid that the prospects of an official process of negotiation being launched, whether at the international level or just at the regional level, right now are very slim. And especially the international level, I quibble a little bit with Khalid's assertion. In terms of the US role, I still think the US role is the only actor that can do this internationally. Of course, you're going to bring other actors, to the table in a Madrid-like peace conference, if we come to that. But given its leverage, given its influence, no matter, how limited it is on Israel, I think US is the only actor. Whether this administration can do it, I tend to agree with Khalid's description there, or assertions that I don't think this is the administration that can do this. The president has lost a lot of capital. I mean, if we compare, for example, how this administration, how this president behaved versus how the administration in 1973 behaved. After the war, after Jordan and Egypt attacked Israel, and then you had the famous airlift from the US to Israel, and then $2.2 billion aid bill passed by Congress then in 1973 to Congress. And now, Kissinger has just passed away. But even, Kissinger, with all the negativity that is about him, in the Middle East, even at the time, he was trying to balance, how he was dealing with Israel, pressuring Israel, but also he was dealing with the Arabs, pressuring the Arabs, partly, with an eye toward preserving credibility for the US to play the role it eventually played in the peace agreement that he helped and the administration helped usher. I think this administration, building on what Khalid said, by giving this carte blanche from the get-go to Israel, by having no nuanced approach whatsoever in terms of the two sides in the conflict, no strings, no conditionality. You have an American president, and I'm not aware, I stand to be corrected, attending a war cabinet, an Israeli war cabinet meeting, which was very shortly thereafter followed by the launch of the Israeli onslaught on northern Gaza, which ended up killing 15,000 Palestinians. That, him attending that meeting was interpreted in the Arab region as signing off on the Israeli military plans. The administration, the American president, became basically complicit. He became a co-owner of what happened afterwards. And I don't know how they can walk away from that. How can they talk about a revitalized Palestinian authority to come and govern Gaza? Which brings me to the second point. I think the immediate question, once this end state is reached, and we don't know what when it will be reached, partly because we don't know what are the Israeli success criteria, eradicating Hamas. Even the, Joint Chiefs Chairman, General Brown, recently said in an interview, this is a pretty tall order, this eradicating of Hamas. So absent that, what is the Israeli success criterion that will determine when they decide to end their military onslaught on Gaza, assuming that it's going to be relaunched soon once this, 2-day truce that was negotiated by Egypt and Qatar expires. So when is this end state? How will Gaza look by the time of this end state? Are we talking about, the devastation in the south, given the density, which is much higher now that many people from the north moved into the south? The death toll in the south might be even higher than 15,000. We are talking about maybe 30,000, 35,000 civilian killed. Majority of, a big portion of them, like in the case of the north, will be children. So, anyway, when will this be reached? What is the end state? Who's going to stop Israel, in this going forward? So far, we have seen from the administration no interest in conditioning aid, to Israel, as some members of the Progressive Democratic Party in Congress are calling for. Jake Sullivan recently said, no, we are not going to pursue that. No interest in calling for a permanent ceasefire, no interest in, supposedly they are talking with Israel about how to make their strikes more surgical rather than how not to do the strikes to start with. But once we reach that end state, I think the big issue is going to be governance, right? So who's going to govern Gaza? I tend to agree with Khalid. I don't see anybody wanting to go in, neither from the Arab side, in terms of an Arab peacekeeping force. Egypt, Jordan, the rest said, forget about it. Internationally, Dan Serwer recently wrote an analysis, which I would like to quickly mention, based on some work that RAND has done on nation building in other settings, in situations like, Bosnia, Kosovo, East Timor, which basically in terms of population are very similar to Gaza. And so it can be a good comparison. According to Dan's analysis, based on the RAND's analysis, any kind of international intervention to secure security in Gaza, assuming Israel wants to go that route, the Americans want to go that route, would require 23,000 international troops, 3,000 international police, on top of 6,000 local troops, and where these local troops are going to come, I don't know, and 4,500 local police. The whole police force of the PA is 10,000. So how many are they going to move to Gaza? And that kind of operation will cost about $6 billion annually. I don't see any interest by any quarter, even countries that typically give to UN peacekeeping forces, India, Bangladesh, Nepal, to really send forces into a conflict theater like Gaza, even after the fighting ends. So my immediate interest is going to be security. Who's going to give security? And that's why the scenario that Khalid talks about, which is a long-term insurgency, a la what Americans experienced in Iraq, in this case, led and co-led by Hamas, whatever is left of Hamas in Gaza, Islamic Jihad, other groups as well. And so the question is, under this scenario, the only kind of process that I can see maybe starting to tackle questions or conditions or conditionality, like or some kind of scenario like what Khalid is talking about, this entangling between the PA, PLO, what happens. But also remember, Hamas has to do some internal work as well, like the PLO did, in order to be accepted as a negotiating party. This whole idea of Hamas being a terrorist organization and hence cannot be accepted at the negotiation table, I don't think it applies here. The PLO used to be like that, PLO, if we remember, used to be a terrorist organization and not accepted as a negotiating partner. And then after that, they did amendment to their charter, negotiation, track 2. And I think similar kind of track 2 need to be done also with Hamas in terms of basically bringing them to the stage of being acceptable as a negotiating partner going forward sometime down the line. But the only track I can see is a track 1.5, track 2.0, where people from Israel, from Palestine, but also from the region. I think only doing bilaterally is too emotional, is too raw. You have to bring the region. You have to bring the Turks, you have to bring the Saudis, you have to bring the Emiratis, you have to bring the Iranians, you have to bring, I mean, if they sit with the Israelis, that's up to them. But you have to bring Europeans, and you have to bring some Americans to really start thinking beyond, outside the box, in a track 1.5, track 2 scenario. That's where I would start.
Thank you very much, Rhonda. Tirita, Biden, as soon as he came to power, he was adamant about leaving Afghanistan, and he managed to do that, since we knew he opposed it all along. Even despite the loss, how the U.S. exited, how ugly it looked. At the end of the day, people gave him a credit or pass, depending on where you looked. Basically, they said, we needed to leave at some point anyway. And then on Ukraine, right, he was able to bring together the West and, made an argument, and then Europeans got involved even more. Then he set out to counter China. He was, having problems with that. And then he established the Alliance of Democracies, which was a bit, criticized quite a bit. But anyway, at the end of the day, what I'm trying to get at is that on foreign policy, on number of issues so far, prior to Gaza, Biden administration had more or less an okay record, let's say. A lot of people would consider it maybe a good record because he was able to push back against Russia. I'm not going to talk about the assessment of that, but I'm just summarizing that to see what you think this, Gaza fighting, Israel's war in Gaza, has done to American global standing, because, it's going to be much harder for the Biden administration to go and talk to anyone about, democracy, human rights, elections, etc. So how do you see that? And I know you have to leave immediately. Feel free to leave after your comments, but I have 2 questions for the rest. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Kadir. I think this is one of the things that have been overlooked to a very large extent. Understandably, a lot of the focus, of course, is what's happening in Gaza itself and the very atrocious number of deaths. But the damage that this has done to US global standing really cannot be underestimated. And it goes back to some of the things that already have been mentioned in this conversation. The fact that Biden attended the war cabinet has been read in the region, rightly or wrongly, that Biden approved of the manner in which Israel has conducted its war. The fact that he questioned the death numbers coming from the Palestinians, the fact that he kept on referring to beheaded babies, even when his own staff tried to take it out of the speech because it had not been verified. All of these different things, and then combined it, of course, with all of the language that was used on Ukraine and the necessity of standing up, bombardment of cities and hospitals are completely unacceptable. That cannot be established as a rule. All of those different things have been violated in manners that have really cost the United States a tremendous amount of credibility, not just in the region, but worldwide. Former Indian National Security Advisor told me that this is the final nail in the coffin of the rules-based international order, which was something that was a very high priority for the Biden administration, particularly mindful of its focus on China. And this is then causing countries outside of the region as well to increasingly view a unipolar world led by the United States as one in which the degree to which rules will be set aside if they are violated by the US or by US allies is going to be even higher than it was before. And the alternative that they see then is perhaps an uncertain world, but one in which, because of a multipolar structure of the world, opportunities to balance against the US will exist in a manner that does not exist today, certainly didn't exist 10 or 15 years ago, but in the future they will exist. And I think it's going to have a profound impact on how a very large number of countries, particularly middle powers, will make their choices going forward as to whether they want to move deeper into the American camp or opt for a world in which the US will remain the most powerful country in the globe, but it will be a more multipolar structure that allows countries the options of both playing major powers against each other, but also be able to balance against them if they go down a path that is perceived to be very, very radical. And this was something the administration had really hoped that it would avoid. They saw Putin's invasion of Ukraine as something that really boosted America's standing, given what Russia had done. And one has to admit the isolation of Russia on Ukraine is, weeks after that illegal invasion of Russia, is pretty much the US's isolation globally on its position on Gaza, and particularly the position on refusing a ceasefire. Ultimately, that's going to be tremendously costly to the US. We may not be able to see it right away. We will see it soon enough, I fear.
Thank you very much, Trita. I have two audience questions that I want to move to, and then Khalid and Randa, please. We had some technical issues today, so we started later, but some brief responses to these. Khalid, somebody's mentioning to a council, but council stated that Israel will have to face the consequences of the inhumane crimes it committed in Gaza. Can you clarify what kind of consequences? I don't know if you refer to this, but there's this debate, obviously, to the one of the perhaps unique things was that the Israeli commanders in the very first days, they announced their intention to basically demolish this area. And it's one of the hardest things is to establish intent, in war crimes. Do you see that process gaining any kind of steam? The legal route, Palestinians have gone through all sorts of legal things over the past many decades, and oftentimes it doesn't really produce tangible results for them. But given this particular question, how do you think that could play out?
It's an important question. I do think that accountability matters. It matters certainly to the people who've been most directly affected on the ground. And then, frankly, it should matter to everyone. There should be accountability for the atrocities that were committed on October 7th, and there should be accountability for all of the many atrocities being committed since then by Israel. And I think there's going to be more pressure on the International Criminal Court. We know that they're doing an investigation. They have been for a few years now. We know that there are renewed calls to expand the investigation. We know that the ICC prosecutor went a few weeks ago to Rafah. He made a point to show his presence, which I think is an important signal to the West in particular. I don't know at the end of the day if it will be enough to actually produce indictments, because I think, we don't like to think of something like a court being politicized, but we know that it is. I would expect the United States, the UK, Germany, other Western powers who are very close to Israel to be pushing very, very hard against any kind of indictments in the future. Whether European countries can, there might be accountability there in terms of things like universal jurisdiction, that there could be cases brought against Israeli and potentially even figures from those countries, whether German or British or American, some type of legal action. Those might be possible, but at the end of the day, I think it's unlikely. because of the politicization of the process. And it's I think to the detriment of, as Trita said, to the detriment of what we used to call the rules-based international order. And I use it in the past tense because I don't think we can ever go back to a credible discussion or to refer to an international rules-based order with the same level of seriousness as we used to. I think Israel has dramatically changed the laws of warfare as a de facto matter. I think future aggressors will adopt the Israeli paradigm of, well, they're human shields. We don't target civilians. They're all human shields. I think it's only a matter of time before we see those kinds of rationalizations. Things that used to draw criticism and alarm, even by the United States, not too long ago, attacking a civilian target because of the presence of one even high-value military target, a Hamas commander of some sort. In the past, when Israel would do that and kill a dozen civilians, the United States, the George Bush administration, no less, George W. Bush, in the midst of the war on terror, called Israel out on that publicly. Today, Israel does the same, kills 10 times as many people in a single bombing in Jabalia camp, kills 100 or 150 people with one single bomb in order to target a single individual. And the international community is basically silent. So the laws of war have changed. And I don't think the rules-based order is going to survive. The other point I would make is part of the irony is that the worse things get, the more atrocities that are committed, the greater the atrocities. And we're now looking at, I think, it's almost inevitable that Israel will do in the south what it has done in the north. And we're going to see very, very large numbers of civilians being killed again there. The worse it gets, the harder it is for the United States or Germany or the UK or those countries that have been so full-throated in their support for Israel, the harder it will become for them to climb down from that perch. So it's not necessarily the case that there will be some dramatic high casualty event and then people will say, oh no, they've gone too far, this time we have to rein them in. I think to the contrary, the more high casualty events we see, the more people talk in terms of genocide and use that terminology, the harder it will be for the US to rein in or even have the will to rein in Israel, because it will mean essentially admitting that we were wrong from the start to give them that blank check from the outset. So they will have to keep coming up with more and more rationalizations and tell themselves, no, they're significantly eroding Hamas's abilities. Ceasefire, we're not ready yet, but at some point in the future, soon, and they'll just keep, it's like the frog in the boiling water story. You don't realize that it's too late until it's too late. And I think, sadly, tragically, that is where things are headed. I think we are headed towards something that future historians will describe as genocide and quite possibly also ethnic cleansing, because once they move in the south, those Palestinians, those now 2 million Palestinians crammed into the south, will have no place to go except across the border. And at that point, I fear it's going to be too late.
Thank you, Khalid. Randa, you largely answered this in your initial remarks, but one of the questions says, if the war on Gaza restarts again, do you see a possibility of horizontal escalation? Even if there's no intervention from the other states, would the axis of resistance of armed militia be involved on a fuller scale?
I think it's possible, but again, I think the fact that they haven't done so until now, I think makes me guess that they are not going to escalate beyond what we have seen. Again, incremental, proportional. However, this possibility of a strike, a drone killing a number of American service members in Syria or in Iraq, then, in my opinion, introduces new dynamics. But even then, I don't think the Americans are interested in escalating, into a wider regional war. I think everybody has more of an interest to keep this limited to Gaza. But I wouldn't say the chance or the likelihood, of this escalating beyond what we have seen, beyond Gaza and involving Lebanon, involving, more hits on Iraq, is not in the cards. Even possibly, without any kind of pressure on the Israelis. I know that hitting Iran was on the is part of the target list as well at some point. The argument that they said we have to go toward the head of the octopus, when they talk about the proxy network. So everything becomes possible depending on the dynamics in Gaza. However, and depending on what can happen by accident, in interaction between these parties in Syria and Iraq and Hezbollah and U.S. assets and Israel. But I think because it has gone so long without it escalating into a major war, I think the likelihood of then the escalation into the major war is much lower now. It would have happened earlier if there was an intention on the part of, for example, Hezbollah to do it. They would have done it by now.
Well, thank you, Randa. Thank you, Khalid, and thank you, Trita, for making this event a great success. I mean, there's a lot to talk about. It's been, this is such a complex issue, but at the same time, it's a very simple issue for depending where you look at it from. And I really appreciate your expertise and insights, and I hope to see you on another occasion soon. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.